Hello, everyone, and welcome to Language Matters Indigenous Voices Series. Today we have a very special guest. We are honored to speak to Priscilla Colón, who is a remarkable leader in the field of Indigenous languages revitalization. So, Priscilla is many things. She is a writer, a teacher, an artist, and a self proclaimed language nerd. In 2021, Priscilla launched Casa Arieta to revitalize Taíno language and culture with the mission to ensure that every Taíno descendant knows who they are and where they come from. In 2023, Priscilla launched a Taíno conference, the first international Taíno language conference in the world. And in June of 2024, she was appointed a co-chair of UNESCO Ad-hoc Group 1, which is part of the UNESCO Decade of Indigenous Languages. And Ad-hoc Group 1 is leading the discussion and the work and provision of education and domains for Indigenous languages. So from digital apps and virtual gatherings to global policy advocacy, Priscilla's efforts help reconnect Taíno descendants around the world and remind us all that our linguistic heritage is a living and shared legacy. Welcome, and I'm so grateful to have the honor to talk to Priscilla today. So, Priscilla, my first question is, what inspired you to dedicate your life's work to the Taíno language and culture?
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. And I have to say, this is the perfect venue as the Language Matters podcast to talk about why language matters. And for me, language has always been a part of my life. So if I may, I'd love to talk a little bit about where my journey began. Um, so I am a child of people who moved from the Caribbean up to the New England area of the United States. So my ancestry is in the Caribbean. My parents were much, much older when they had me. So my first language was actually Spanish, so their language. And I didn't learn English until I was about 8 years old. And I was in a second grade classroom with folks from all around the world. Kids were from Thailand and Taiwan and Germany and Israel. And so it was like having a mini UN, right? And I look back on that journey and I realize, wow, that learning English in this setting was really preparing me for some of the work that I'm doing now at age 45, so many years later. So for me, speaking a second language, being around folks who spoke many languages was actually pretty normalized as a child. Later on, I learned a little bit of French. And after college, I started teaching Spanish to middle school kids. And I spent the next 20 years working in education. So in educational publishing companies with language learning apps, developing curricula, publishing. I mean, I had a wonderful professional life. And suddenly in 2019, I just turned 40 years old. I realized that I needed to really reconnect with my roots. I didn't really know a lot about my heritage. I knew a little bit what I had studied in school. I knew that my parents had said, of course, we're Indigenous. And being from, having Caribbean heritage, I knew that our heritage included African, Indigenous, and Spaniard at least, but I really didn't know much else besides that. Because I'd worked in languages, I realized, well, I'm interested in that aspect. Maybe there's something about the Indigenous language of my ancestors that is being worked on. And for, I would say, about 6 months, I just kept hitting a wall. There were some dictionaries with a few words here or there, nothing that I could use to really create full sentences. And then I stumbled on this book by a fellow Boricua, that is an Indigenous Taíno person of Boriquen, which is modern day Puerto Rico. And he had spent 9 years working to revitalize the Taíno Indigenous language. And when I listened to him speak about his process, I realized he was onto something. So to back up a little bit and tell you about the Taíno people were the first Indigenous Americans that Europeans met in 1492. On that fateful day when Columbus came with his men, he met our people. And so, as this first language of contact, um, it influenced a lot of European and other languages around the world. So we speak a lot of it. A lot of the words from Taíno, such as barbecue, barbacoa, hammock, hamaca, cassava, manatee, guava. We could go on and on and on. All of those words are Taíno, right?
So we speak Taíno and we don't even know it.
Exactly right.
I speak Taíno.
Exactly. I've met folks from as far away as Iran or Japan, and Taíno is part of their language because it's been integrated into all these other languages in the world.
But Taíno is technically considered extinct, right? At least in the European narratives. So how are you revitalizing an extinct language?
Yeah, I know. It seems a little crazy to do.
And you're now
to do
having
that.
a first conference in that
Yes.
language. So
when I discovered this linguist who was working on it, I realized he was following a process that had been used before to revitalize or create a new, modern, reconstructed version of a language that hadn't been spoken in centuries at this point. So you're right, Taíno is considered an extinct language. It is still categorized as such by the World Atlas of Languages, something that we're going to be changing very soon. However, the process to revitalize the language that he used is very similar to how modern Hebrew was created. So modern Hebrew hadn't been spoken in hundreds of years, but there was some text, and the initial reconstruction was to start using some of the Yiddish and Ladino and other words that modern Hebrew people would have spoken, and the language was reconstructed using that method. So that's a very similar method that is being used to revitalize other languages around the world, indigenous languages as well, such as the Wampanoag language in Massachusetts, which uses some of the sister languages of the indigenous people in the area to fill in the blanks of what was left. So for Taíno, we had left in print and also integrated into languages such as English, Spanish, French, and so on, anywhere between 500 and 3,000 words. 3,000 on the high end if you include toponyms like place names or people's names that were recorded in history. It's not enough to reconstruct a language. So the method that this hyperpolyglot, his name is Javier Hernandez, used was to start looking at sister languages. So languages with 200, 300,000 speakers, native languages that were related to the original Taíno. So these include the Arawak speakers, the Locono people in Venezuela, in Guyana, the Wayu speakers in Colombia and Venezuela, Garifuna, which is another sister language, and so on. So he began piecing together borrowing words from these sister languages, and also having to create new words because planes and trains and computers and all of these other things did not exist in the late 1400s, early 1500s. So it was a process of piecing together what remained, borrowing, and also creation. And I myself love that because as I've been working with so many languages from around the world in education, I realized that language is constantly evolving. I worked on a language project a while ago with somebody out of Pakistan, and we were working on including terms such as internet and GPS. And so new words have to be created.
And I have kids that have about a 10-year-old gap between them. And I can tell you that the language, my language, the language of my older kids, and the language of my child who's currently in high school is completely different languages. They use already different words, different slang. So language is living. It's incredibly fascinating. And the fact that a language can be revived is something that gives us all hope. So, yes, what amazing.
It really does. And I love that the fact that language is alive. That's the whole point of a language. If it doesn't evolve, it can't continue to live. So that's actually an exciting piece of some of the work that I'm doing. So after discovering this book, after being able to meet this amazing person who's working on revitalization, I realized something important, that because of my background, I could use all of my professional skills and all of those experiences to not just learn the language myself, with which I've been doing over the last few years, but then to immediately start sharing it with other people. And I am very much a person of action. Like if I see something that is helping me in some way, I want to share that with others. And I feel like it's an imperative, right? I have these skills, I should be sharing it. And so I started just by posting on YouTube, creating language and culture lessons, pointing out some of these really cool, fun facts, like the fact that we're already speaking Taíno, most of us are. And then also just using ways in which I had learned to teach learners to be learners, better learners, easy ways to learn.
And how many, and you have people who are now wanting to participate, wanting to learn, and wanting to speak the language, right?
That's exactly right. So our videos, I mean, at this point, we've been at it for about 3 or 4 years. We have more than 450 videos available now. I got to meet wonderful folks who are using these videos to teach others. There's a wonderful organization in Boriquen, Puerto Rico, that is working with students, and they're doing all kinds of really cool collaborative activities and teaching the language along with our videos.
So why such a drive, right? Because there is also a movement, and we're hearing it in some countries where other languages are discouraged. And actually, on a global political stage, and we've seen some articles. I'm going to reference Gerald Roche, with whom I was on the Coalition for Language Rights, and who is in Australia. He just published a wonderful piece talking about language rights and how in certain countries people are told that they cannot use their language. They need to use the main country's language. So why such a drive? Why don't we just all speak, one language, right? Why there's such a drive? What does language mean to you?
That's such a great question. Language to me, I mean, I could go in many different directions and say, well, studies have proven X, Y, Z. Yes, we could go into the studies. But language to me specifically is a way to heal. Now, our indigenous ancestors experienced the brunt and the brutality of colonization and forced assimilation. They were declared extinct about 500 years ago. Much of what they passed on was very little. And if they did pass it on, it was in secretive ways, because it was forbidden to speak the language. Even they were labeled pejorative terms if they spoke their language or spoke in their dialect, because it wasn't, quote unquote, the correct way of speaking. And there's so much trauma that our community really needs to heal. A lot of it is also self-imposed. So if, for example, if you were considered indigenous, you were considered a country bumpkin. So you had this weight on your shoulders about who you were as a people or your legacy as indigenous. The indigenous people, specifically Taíno, were labeled docile, and they just kind of keeled over and died. That was the socio-political, like the perspective, colonial perspective that was imposed. And so the work that I'm doing really is about healing that ancestral trauma. It's about saying, no, we are survivors. Our language survived, our traditions survived, and we just need to look a little bit under the surface. And once you begin to start healing from that, you begin to start realizing who you really are as a person, that you have so much more to contribute, that you really are multilingual, and that's a wonderful way to be in this world that is connected at this moment. In 1 minute I could be speaking to you here, we're in different parts of the country, but I could be speaking to someone in Nigeria or someone in Japan. And what a blessing to be able to have that flexibility to speak in different languages.
So language is part of who we are, and we don't want to lose who we are, even after our language is extinct. And what a beautiful part that is. And I don't know if you have noticed, but I speak English and I speak Russian, and I speak a little bit of French still. And what I've noticed is that when we interact, when we switch from language to language, even with the same person, our conversation changes. It can be more formal in one language and immediately becomes less formal in a different language. The norms of even asking questions, the norms of space in between people, the norms of body language, all of that changes when we switch from language to language. So it's almost like it has its own flavor, its own rainbow, its own light in the way we interact.
Absolutely. And I'm fascinated by language, not because I want to speak all the languages. I actually want to know how people think. And when you start learning a new language or you pick up on certain phrasing in a language, you realize what's important to the people who speak that language. What are the key things? So I'll give you an example. In many indigenous languages in the Americas, the verbs may have a little ending to signify whether something is animate or inanimate. So whether something has life. So life, that has meaning for those speakers, right? And when you start, for example, learning Taíno, you start picking up on key words, little particles within words that tell you that there's a certain meaning. For example, the word ya is spirit. Ya ya is great spirit. So we're talking about the creator spirit, the spirit that is within all of us. Well, that ya is also in the word yabisi, which means tree. And so then you start making these connections. You're like, wait, hold on. Our ancestors really saw this connection between us and the world around us and nature, and everything has spirit.
I just got goosebumps you telling me that. I just got goosebumps. It's such an amazing thing. So we can learn not just about who we are, but from learning who we are and from having different perspective of the way we look at the world, we can maybe even change the way we interact with the world. And then change the way we innovate, change the way we invent, change the way we progress as humanity.
Absolutely. So, and it's all encompassing too. Like I'm the kind of person who like I see the connections among things, right? Amongst things. So for example, if you were a student who was learning about agriculture right now and maybe talking about preservation of water and ensuring that there's enough water for folks, well, you would benefit from knowing, for example, that the word toa is in many of the rivers in Boriken, in Cuba, and other islands. Toa is a word that refers to mother's milk. Why would mother's milk be in the word for rivers? Because our ancestors literally saw the rivers as Mother Earth's milk, the thing that fed us, that kept us alive. And what better way to honor, that the wisdom of the ancestors by honoring Mother Earth. And I think that would motivate a student who's working in, whether it's like environmental studies or something else, to continue that ancestral legacy and find ways in which to continue, keeping our waters pure and helping with agriculture and so many other things.
And our interconnectedness with nature, because we are also part of all of that.
Yes.
Switching a little bit. So what do DNA at home kits have to do with language revitalization?
Oh, yeah, that seems like completely different thing. So, but it is very much tied into our Taíno indigenous ancestry. So I mentioned earlier that our people were declared extinct in about 1565. The Spanish crown declared the Taíno people of Haiti, which is the island now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic, they were declared extinct. A lot of that had to do with paper genocide. So they literally were not counting people in the census. So like women weren't being counted, children under a certain age. Then categories of people kept changing based on whatever the Spanish crown declared. People were lumped into one category, such as brown or colored. So the identity kept getting erased to the point where we were basically declared extinct. And then that started being fed to many generations of children through official school books. So the textbooks by the 1950s in Puerto Rico were basically treating our indigenous ancestors as extinct people, that they were gone and that they had maybe left some vestiges of their language and some foods, but really hadn't contributed to us as modern day Puerto Ricans. Which is very strange because when you look around and you say, yeah, but my grandmother and my mother and me and like the way that they're raising us, there's a lot of indigeneity here. But it was like the erasure of people on paper. In 2010, a Puerto Rican professor revealed his pioneering study. He had done this genetic study in Puerto Rico that found out that 61% of Puerto Ricans have indigenous DNA passed on through their mothers. So for people that were declared extinct in 1565, how could 61% of the population be indigenous and had been, quote unquote, officially lied to the point where we ourselves did not believe the truth of who we were? And so because by 2010 and then in the following years, at-home DNA kits became very inexpensive, most of us started buying them and saying, wait, I want to know if the stories that my parents have told me is true, if I'm indeed indigenous. And I was one of those people. I bought a $99 at-home DNA kit and I tested and I was like, yeah, this is no surprise. I'm indigenous, I'm African, I'm European. But the fact that that indigenous strand still exists was kind of a moment of awakening for folks. And right around that time, that linguist, Javier Hernandez, he said, he'd realized the study had come out and he felt that he had this kind of renewed urge to continue working on revitalizing the language. It almost gave us permission to be who we always said we were. Now, I'm not saying that DNA kits are the end all be all. I'm not saying just because you have, the genetics is telling you that you are indigenous. If you weren't raised as indigenous, you may not feel it. However, in this case, we're actually using modern genetic science to prove what we already knew.
And we're using, and it again proves the power of language. If somebody tells you that the power of words, using the word extinct made people almost give up and not look. And using the word revitalize brings life and growth back. And so it's kind of like a revival. And we can see how one word, revival of the Taíno and indigenous culture versus extinct Taíno and holds even completely different energy, meaning, interaction, and everything. So the power of words, the power of language demonstrate themselves again, even in this example.
Absolutely. And I would say, like, it kind of makes you stand up a little straighter and you're like, yeah, that's right. I know who I am. And then you realize that you want to search a little bit more, right? You want to discover a little bit more. That's the journey that I've been on. It's a journey of self-discovery. And through that, it's also made me feel closer to that ancestry that maybe I wouldn't have felt otherwise.
Okay, so let's switch again, and co-chair of UNESCO Ad-hoc Group 1. Oh my God. So tell me more about it. Tell us more about it. What does the group do? What is the goal? And you are leading now a global effort.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I feel like it's one of those pinch me moments. It makes me feel awe and wonder and humility, and it's exciting, and because it goes back to those ancestors, right? So we were declared extinct so long ago. I can imagine their voices not being heard. And what better way to make their voices heard if I speak up, right? If I am their descendant, then now it's my responsibility. I have the experience, I have the ability to do it. I'm in a position to do it. Why not? And of course, I'm not the only one who's speaking up, who's revitalizing the language and culture, but I feel through this specific venue, I can do it now at an international level. So this came about really miraculously. We worked on the conference that you mentioned in 2023. I wanted it to create a space where we could share and learn together, because there was a lot of work being done, whether it was archaeology, symbology, linguistics, education. It was all being done, but in silos. And so I wanted to gather folks from around the United States, the Caribbean, to come together and share information. It was a wonderful event. And then I went knocking on UNESCO's door and I said, okay, we created this event. We want to be official contributors to the International Decade. And we were actually approved to be a partner with them. So I thought that was wonderful. The first order of business was to get Taíno on their official list, because it was declared extinct. It was not on the official list of the International Decade. So I was like, okay, let's get the list, let's get Taíno on the list first. And then we were able to bring all of these amazing presentations that we had recorded as official contributions. So 530 years later, after being declared extinct, now we have proof. We're still here and we're revitalizing our language and our culture. So, I mean, for me, that was the number one thing I wanted to do. And then while we were talking with the folks at the Secretariat, they mentioned we're going to create these ad hoc groups. And so let me tell you a little bit about the ad hoc groups. So in 2022, the IDIL was established, the International Decade. For the last couple of years, they've been coming up with objectives. So what was the goal of this decade? What is it that we want to achieve? And so they set up 4 ad hoc groups to meet those goals. Ad hoc group 1 is in charge of educational provisions and domains. That means that we are going to be evaluating the current status of education for Indigenous languages across 194 UNESCO member countries. Based on the current status, we're going to be providing what would be some of the ideal ways in which we can preserve and revitalize Indigenous languages across all 194 UNESCO member countries, of course, with the collaboration and insights from policymakers and Indigenous communities, who are the ones who are, battling every day to preserve their languages, and then advocate for implementation of those policies to ensure that Indigenous languages prevail. Now, that is the work that Ad hoc Group 1 is taking on. And we have Ad hoc Group 2, 3, and 4 who are dealing with different topics, technology, for example, intergenerational exchange of information, databases, and so on. The reason I was attracted to working with Ad hoc Group 1 is I spent my time as a teacher working on curriculum design. I have spent so much time working on Indigenous language and other language education. I thought this was a great pairing for the work that I'm doing now, that I'm passionate about. And what a blessing to be able to do it, not just for Taíno, but for all other Indigenous languages around the world. I think that is going to be a key to work together as an Indigenous global community to revitalize.
The power of the community is amazing, and the power and the drive of the community, and the sometimes we don't realize how much power we have as the power of one. And I just want to acknowledge that in your case, the power of one driving this whole revival of the Taíno language, and now leading in a way, a global effort, by example, showing other communities. I just want to acknowledge what a huge accomplishment, and wow, congratulations.
Oh, thank you. I get the shivers, honestly, because it shows me that everything is possible. It really does. I've always been a very positive person. I always find a way forward. But to imagine that we together can move forward, and it just takes somebody saying, hey, I can see it. I can see that glimmer of light. And if we just kind of join together, we can reach it together. And maybe it just takes one inspiring word, right? Maybe it takes a little push here and there, but I truly believe that we can achieve great things. And I always say, I may be a very action oriented person. I may be very on task all the time, but I'm actually imagining 50 generations from now, 100 generations from now. Maybe like one email that I sent to one person will mean that 50 generations from now, we're going to be seeing movies on the big screen, all in Taíno and a bunch of different indigenous languages. Like, I can't imagine what those generations will look like and how healed they will be and how proud they will be of their indigenous ancestry because of one little thing that I did today.
That is amazing. And for those who are watching and who are inspired by the work, how can they help support the Indigenous language revitalization effort, whether it's Taino or another language?
Oh my gosh. So let's start with the global Indigenous languages. So I'll give you a way that you can do it. Early next year in March, we're going to be launching the 4 ad hoc groups are going to be launching a survey that will go out to policymakers and Indigenous communities around the world. We want to hear every single Indigenous person's voice as much as possible. We want to know, what are your challenges? What are your successes? Is there content in your language? Do your teachers get to train and prepare for teaching your language? Is your language even recognized by your country? We want to hear because you're the folks on the ground. So I would ask Indigenous communities, policymakers, anyone interested, allies, to pay attention to the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Follow them online and watch for that survey launch because we really want broad participation. We cannot, as Ad hoc Group 1, create policies on our own in silos. This is not about us dictating what should be done. We want to hear from the people who are affected every day, who need to fight every day to preserve and revitalize their languages. So that's the number one thing. Start following the International Decade and be just ready to participate in these events that are coming up, like the survey. One simple thing that I always ask folks is if you learned something, for example, about Taíno, for example, the fact that barbecue, barbacoa, is actually a Taíno word. If that's all you learn and you find it fascinating, I want you to share that with someone. And then I know that person will share it with someone else, and that person will share it with someone else. And in the end, millions more will know that Taíno people aren't extinct, that we are still here, that we're working to revitalize our language and our culture. So sharing a fun fact about whether that's Taíno or another language that you learn is just going to help create more allyship and more community and continue that survival, that thriving actually of those languages. So that's another way that you can do it. And of course, we have lots of information online. Our organization, Casareito, for example, is constantly posting information about the language. We, of course, have our Reencuentro Taíno conference as well, which is happening again next year. I am incredibly excited about that. If I may for a little bit, our next year's theme is We Are Connected. And our goal is to showcase not just the Taíno language, but the collaboration that is happening among Taíno people and other Indigenous communities. We're sharing and collaborating in keeping all of our languages alive. So those are some ways.
That is amazing. That is amazing. And we will have all these links in both the description about this podcast and on the check out the last slide where you will, after we close the presentation, and check out the description. And thank you so much, Priscilla. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for inspiring people around the world every day.
Ha home. Thank you so much.
Thank you.